scene setting and building suspense in the early parts of Aurora Floyd. Although this is a suspense novel, Mary Braddon begins the novel very subtly and very slowly. There is an element of suspense being built into the quiet descriptions of the countryside, English countryside, beautiful in the lingering autumn sunshine. There are descriptions of the country home of the family, in particular the daughter of the family that we're going to get to know most during the course of the novel, i.e. the Floyd family home and Aurora Floyd, the daughter of the family. The setting of the house is minutely, graphically, and again very beautifully portrayed. All in this wonderful, lingering, long autumn sunshine. This golden light bathes the environment and the setting of this family. We are swept back into the past of the family as well. We understand that at present there's a relatively elderly parent and his daughter living in this house, but we're swept right back to the past of when Archibald Floyd meets his wife, Aurora's mother, Eliza Percival. The story is very simply narrated. This happened, then that happened, these feelings arose, therefore the next stage of the romance occurred. There's very little psychological discussion of the processes that a confirmed bachelor like Archibald Floyd was at the time would have gone through in suddenly meeting a wonderful young woman whom he falls madly in love with and finds irresistible. There's no discussion about the profound psychological response that a woman like Eliza Percival, who has spent years working as a jobbing actress in a repertory company, travelling around the country with very little money, struggling to make ends meet. Her deep and profound inner responses to this attention are not really given. Her social and moral conduct responses to the interest of an older man in her as a younger, very beautiful actress are narrated. She's wary of the situation, but how she feels deep down isn't really opened up to us. So it's a fairy tale. There's very little realism, there's very little naturalism. If we compare it, for example, with other novels, if we think about George Eliot's Middlemarch, we think about how Dorothea very carefully how the very careful psychological processes and processes of reasoning and rationale that Dorothea goes through prior to making her decision to marry Casaubon, working in fact to get him to propose to her. And also if we think about her sister Celia's responses to how Dorothea is embarking upon entering marriage, there's a lot more even in her thinking than occurs in this novel. So there's really very little attempt at realism. It's a fairy tale. It's the Cinderella fairy tale, except that it's not princes and the aristocracy. It's a self-made prince of banking, essentially. And the social nuance is actually quite important. The self-made social nuance here is quite important. At all events, it's a fairy tale. The couple marry. Eliza makes a seamless transition to the life of the lady of the manor, albeit not a hereditary manor, but nonetheless it's a large country estate, and there are people living in the surrounding areas who are considerably less well off, and that role of the lady of the manor falls to her. It's a large house. It will have had a large staff of servants to order and to direct, and again coming from this completely different socio-economic background, of being an actress, of living in lodgings, having grown up in small dwellings in the industrial areas of Liverpool. Eliza's father was a merchant, a captain in the Merchant Navy. Again, it's unlikely that she could have seamlessly made the transition to running a large household like Felden Woods. I think it would have been difficult. But actually, the happiness of the couple, the seamlessness of the transition is what's dwelt upon. The fairy tale ends, however, and Mary Braddon breaks with the traditional story. Archibald and Eliza marry. They live happily, but not happily ever after. Soon after their daughter is born, Eliza falls ill and dies. So, as part of the suspense building of the suspense novel is the fact that tragedy has already hit this family once before. Their wonderful home, as portrayed with a sense of establishment, a sense of its permanence. However, this long, lingering Indian summer, which is progressing deep into the autumn, is not going to last. That is impermanent, and we know that it will subside into winter and that the winter storms will come. And in these rather, as I said before, in these rather subtle and slow ways, the author seeks to build a sense of suspense early on in the plot. There are other ways in which a sense of foreboding hovers around the Floyd family. Their social peers in the area in which they live have taken up a somewhat hostile attitude towards the arrival of Archibald Floyd's wife. These people would be, as well, the squirearchy, the gentry, the local landowners, the majority of whom probably hold their social position as a result of hereditary lands. They will probably have a long history within their family of being landowners. And whilst they are very happy to accept invitations to attend dinners and grand parties at the luxuriant, affluent Floyd household, they nonetheless exhibit a strong level of hostility and snobbery towards the new wife, Eliza. Archibald Floyd is a self-made man, and therefore he makes a social error in choosing to marry a woman who is of a lower social class. It was, for the Victorians, a difficult situation. Archibald Floyd, in order to remain socially acceptable and absolutely socially acceptable, at least on the surface of things, and to be accepted fully on the face of things in this landowning class, really needed to marry somebody of his own social standing, or somebody of a higher social standing who came from a historically landed family, in order to bolster and underpin his social credentials. And he hasn't done that. He's fallen in love and, according to the social codes of the day, foolishly then gone ahead and married this unconnected, uneducated woman who doesn't really have anything to recommend her except for her personal qualities, her beauty, her honour and integrity, the kindness and the loveliness of her ways. Those things aren't quite good enough for the Victorian landowning class. Eliza is an outsider. she comes from a different social group. There's a hint as well that she is in some way foreign, that she's not 100% English, not 100% British. This comes forward or comes through in the descriptions of her very dark colouring. And also there is a hint in the fact that her father was a captain in the Merchant Navy. Her mother died as well whilst she was very, very young. Nobody really knows who her mother was, and perhaps her mother actually did come from foreign climes. At all events, there is a form of xenophobia that is manifested by the local gentry towards this new wife. And there is a phrase, spangles and sawdust, referring to her former career as an actress. She didn't work in the circus, although that's what the phrase makes it sound as though she did. She was an actress. Nevertheless, there is a prejudice being manifested towards people who are in that line of work. They are behaving in ways which aren't actually true to their nature. They're saying things that they don't actually believe or actually mean. They are representing themselves as something other than who and what they are. They're acting, in other words, which, of course they're acting because that's their work. But there is a feeling that because Eliza as an individual has engaged so much in false representation as an actress, that she herself must fundamentally be of an evasive, not terribly frank, truthful or open nature. And even if the evidence of meeting Eliza might contradict that, the beliefs about people who are travelling and acting and who come from a different, socially inferior class and who are additionally foreign is that they will not be able to understand the social order, the correct and established codes of behaviour. They won't be able to understand or either produce the nuances of conduct that pertain to being a member of the landed gentry, the squirearchy, the hereditary landed class. As a result of these prejudices, the local families, although they continue to mix with the Floyds, express misgivings and to some extent forebodings about how it can't possibly be expected that all will run well or run smoothly now for Archibald Floyd and his world, because he has made a strong error of judgment. And these misgivings, this disquiet about the underlying nature of Eliza, are passed down to her daughter by the local families. It's considered that Aurora will inherit these, in their eyes, inadequacies in terms of being able to live up to the standards of their world, which was replete with very specific standards and modes and codes of behaviour. It was quite typical in the 19th century that children, but especially girls, were considered to inherit, as if it were genetic, the moral qualities or the moral behaviour of their mothers. Girls inherited the moral qualities of their mothers. So despite the fact that Aurora is being born into a totally different environment from the industrial environment in which Eliza found herself as a young child, being brought up by her aunt, who ran a very small grocery shop in amongst the terraced houses of Liverpool's slums, really. Aurora's being brought up in a very different context. She'll be given a very different education, but still the idea that she will inherit the spangles and the sawdust goes before her in the minds of the local families that know her family. Interestingly, the novel in some ways goes ahead and fulfills these doubts and misgivings. Although that's through the actions of Aurora, but in terms of her personality, her courage, her values, her quite noble generosity, it doesn't fulfill those forebodings. In fact, one might say that that element, that side of Eliza Percival's temperament and character, Aurora does inherit. And in fact, Eliza was not particularly lacking in good judgment about how to behave as a result of the spangles and the sawdust. Aurora does in her teens act with, she makes one fatal social and personal error. It's not just a social error, so as not to give the plot away, I'm not saying exactly what it was. But it's also, Aurora does, as a teenager, commit a very serious error, both in terms of her social judgment, but also in terms of her personal happiness and her personal life. So in some ways, these misgivings are founded. However, the source of Aurora's poor judgment and the reason why Aurora behaves in ways which are for the period unacceptable, unconventional, even for today's world, and the error that she makes would be a serious and unfortunate mistake for a young person as well as a young woman to make. Anybody could make an error such as she makes because her education hasn't been, her upbringing hasn't been closely supervised enough, where her mother has died when she's quite young. Her father, who was a much older parent in any case, and who withdraws into the inordinate levels of grief that he feels at the loss of his wife, does not take the affectionate, active, affectionate interest in his daughter's upbringing, in teaching her how to think, how to act in ways that will demonstrate good judgment. Whilst their relationship is very loving and close in terms of the affection between them, it doesn't seem to be close in terms of confidences and discussions about life and personal feelings are concerned. And we'll discuss this later on as we explore the book more. But I think it's not Aurora's maternal background that leads to a lack of judgment in her life at all. And for the careful reader in the Victorian era, that, I think, eventually, during the course of the plot, comes through, because even Talbot Bulstrode, who at points has been quite judgmental towards Aurora and has been reserved about the extent to which she may have contact with his wife and be admitted into their world softens and puts down a lot of the errors that Aurora has made to the fact that she didn't have a mother to guide her. But we'll discuss the roles of mothers a great deal more further on. The first phases of the novel end with really a tremendous quarrel arising between Aurora and her father, and the reader doesn't know what this quarrel is about exactly, simply that the beloved daughter is banished, sent away to a boarding school in France, that there is a separation which is heartbreaking for both parties. Eventually Aurora returns from her school, anxiously awaited by her father, who obviously hopes to find that the breach of affection between them has been mended, that they're able to take up their relationship again. And they do. Aurora returns, and we understand that someone is dead, and that it is significant with regard to the secret and the quarrel that they are dead. And at that point, Mary Braddon joins the mainstream process of setting up and continuing suspense within a suspense novel. She really enters the genre. Of course, the novel works in terms of the cliffhanger chapter endings as well. There's nearly always a chapter ending that will encourage the reader to want to read on, and that was part as well of the serial publication method of producing literature. Of course, writers and journals wanted the public to go out and buy the next edition of the journal in order to continue reading the exciting stories that were contained in it. So almost all serially published novels would end with some kind of tantalising moment, at the very least, in order to draw the reader back again next week or next fortnight. But it was, of course, stock in trade of the suspense novel that chapter endings would leave you at the point of thinking, what's going to happen next? What on earth can happen next? Mary Braddon in Aurora Floyd less works with evocative chapter headings. The chapter headings are often really quite everyday, actually, in Aurora Floyd. So they don't so much gather the reader in to start reading the chapter, although the endings of the chapters will tend to push the reader on to read the next one. Coming back again to Archibald Floyd being a prince of banking, being a self-made man living in the style of the hereditary landowning class, the country gentry. His rise in the world, commercial world of banking, is also told in the opening chapters and pages of the novel. It's a family history. The family have worked together, the sons of the family have worked together to build this extremely successful bank. And whilst many private banks did collapse quite suddenly in the Victorian era, there's no sense of the possibility that the Bank of the Floyds could possibly collapse. This is a very permanent, well-established enterprise now, and the Floyd family, as a result, may be viewed as being permanently now entered into a certain level of society, a high level of society. The Floyd family would have been very appealing to the middle class readership, and Mary Braddon's readership would have been, broadly speaking, middle class. For the middle classes, although they were good at presenting a front of solid affluence in their large, solidly built Victorian homes with big windows and heavy front doors, robust furnishings, robust furniture and robust furnishings. Curtains were very heavy and heavily draped, sort of banked off the internal space from the external space quite markedly. So this sense of solid, entrenched rank that the middle classes like to build up around themselves was actually quite flimsy. Businesses could rise and fall quickly. There was a lot of speculation involving seafaring and sea trading, and many more shipping accidents happened at that time than do today. Insurance policies were not always particularly good. So it was possible for people living a middle-class life one day through adverse business circumstances to be bounced from that status right down into poverty. And where there were really no social provisions, no social welfare provisions for the poor in those days, this was a very serious situation. The Floyd security would have been highly appealing to the Victorian reader. These were truly the beautiful people. They were the ones who have achieved the dream, the Victorian middle-class dream. So the readership would have been very much on the side of the Floyds, where the local gentry show this level of hostility or animosity that the Floyds aren't quite acceptable. Oh, well, you're here and you're amongst us, but for some reason you're not quite acceptable. There would have been a sense of affinity, there would have been a sense of understanding that social undercutting amongst Mary Braddon's readership. That will have bonded her with the readers, bonded her as an author with her readers and her readership, but also, in this novel specifically, bonded the interest of the majority of her readers with the Floyd family.